The night was cruel, the kind that made even the stars hide behind clouds, as if they couldn't bear to witness the suffering of the earth below. The wind cut through the small village like a sharp blade, howling across empty fields and rattling the thin wooden walls of old houses. It was the heart of winter, a season that showed no mercy to the lonely. In a quiet corner of that village stood Armand's small farmhouse, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered fields and a weary old barn. Armand was known as a kind-hearted man, quiet, hard-working, and always ready to lend a hand. He had lived alone since his parents passed away years ago, and his days were spent tending to his animals, mending fences, and helping neighbors without expecting anything in return. His life was simple, almost too quiet, until that night. He was just about to put out his lantern when he heard it, a faint, desperate sound carried by the wind. At first, he thought it was just the wind moaning through the trees. But then it came again, soft, trembling, human, a cry. Armand froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He grabbed his lantern and stepped out into the snow. The cold bit his face instantly, the kind of cold that burned. The moon was hidden, and the darkness was thick. But the sound came again, from the direction of his barn. Cautiously, Armand moved toward it, his boots crunching over frozen ground. As he pushed the barn door open, the hinges groaned like an old man in pain. The lantern's light spilled into the dark, revealing hay, wooden beams, and shadows. Then he saw her. Curled up in a corner, shivering violently, was a woman, her wedding dress torn and covered in frost. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as snow. Her eyes fluttered open weakly when the light touched her face. "Please, don't send me back," she whispered. Armand's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you? What happened?" But she didn't answer. She was fading. He rushed forward, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shaking shoulders. Her hands were like ice. Without a second thought, he scooped her into his arms. She was light, too light, and carried her into his house. Inside, the fire was nearly dead, but he threw on logs until it roared again. He laid her near the warmth, gently rubbing her hands, praying she'd wake. Slowly, color returned to her face, but her tears fell silently. "Thank you," she murmured, eyes still closed. "I didn't want to die." Armand's chest tightened. He gave her warm water, but she could barely hold the cup. He held it for her, helping her drink small sips. When she finally opened her eyes, he saw how beautiful they were, soft, deep brown, full of sorrow. She looked young, barely in her 20s. Her hair was tangled, her dress muddy and torn. Yet there was something pure about her presence, something that demanded kindness. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. She stared at the fire for a long time before speaking. "My name is Hira," she said in a broken voice. "I was supposed to be married today." Armand's eyes widened. Married? But
"What are you doing here?"
alone in this cold? Her lips trembled as she tried to form the words. "He left me," she whispered. "My husband. He abandoned me before the wedding ceremony ended. Said he couldn't marry me. His family, they threw me out. My own parents turned me away, saying I brought shame to them. I had nowhere to go." Her voice cracked and tears slid down her cheeks. "I walked for hours. The snow started falling. I saw your barn. I just needed shelter. I didn't mean to trespass." Armand's throat tightened with emotion. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "You're safe here now." Hira broke down, sobbing into her hands. Armand didn't say a word. He simply sat nearby, watching the fire and letting her cry. Sometimes silence is the greatest comfort. When the storm outside finally calmed, the world seemed to hold its breath. Hira had fallen asleep near the fire, wrapped in his old blanket. Armand quietly stood, watching her. Something stirred deep inside him, a strange mix of sadness and protectiveness. He didn't know her story completely, but he could feel the pain radiating from her soul, a pain that deserved warmth, not judgment. The next morning, when she awoke, the sunlight filtered through the frosted window. Armand was already outside, feeding his animals. Hira sat up, looking around in confusion. Then realization. She remembered everything. The shame, the rejection, the cold. And now this unexpected kindness. When Armand came in, she stood quickly. "I'll leave soon," she said softly. I don't want to cause trouble. Armand shook his head. You're not going anywhere until you're strong again. You can't even stand without shivering. But what will people say? She asked. Let them talk, he said simply. You're a human being. You deserve warmth, not gossip. For the first time, Hira smiled faintly. A fragile smile, but real. Days passed. Hira helped with small chores around the house. Cooking, feeding chickens, mending clothes. Armand never asked questions, never pried into her past. But every now and then he'd see her standing by the window, staring into the distance with empty eyes. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Hira finally spoke again. Why are you helping me, Armand? You don't even know me. He looked into the flames. Because once, when I was young, someone helped me too. After my parents died, an old farmer gave me food and shelter when I had nothing. I promised myself I'd do the same someday. Maybe you're the reason that promise was made. Hira's eyes glistened with tears. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such simple compassion. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in silence. Inside, two lonely souls shared warmth, one finding safety, the other rediscovering purpose. As Hira watched Armand fix a crack in the window, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Maybe life wasn't over yet. Maybe being abandoned wasn't the end, but the beginning of something unexpected. The night deepened, and Armand placed another log in the fire. Hira turned toward him and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." He looked at her gently and said, "Maybe you were sent here to save me too." Outside, the wind softened, as if the heavens themselves were listening. The old house glowed with the warmth of newfound kindness, the kind that changes lives forever. Days turned into weeks, and the icy grip of winter slowly began to loosen. The snow that had once buried the land started to melt into small, glittering streams. The birds returned, their songs breaking the long silence that had haunted the valley. Life once again began to stir, but inside Armand's farmhouse, a different kind of thawing had already begun, one that started not in the soil, but in two lonely hearts. Hira had changed since the night Armand found her freezing in the barn. The fear that once clouded her eyes was slowly replaced by calm. She spoke more, smiled more, and even laughed quietly at times, though she often caught herself, as if laughter felt forbidden after everything she'd been through. Armand noticed, but he never commented. He treated her like the morning sun, something to be grateful for but never to take for granted. The weight of rumors. In a small village, silence doesn't last long. Whispers are faster than wind. By the end of the first week, people had already begun to talk. She's living in his house? Alone with him. A man and a woman under one roof without marriage. Shameful. She was abandoned once, maybe for a reason. Hira heard the whispers when she went to fetch water from the well. The women looked at her with cold judgment, their voices dipped in poison. Each word struck her like a stone. Dragging her heart back into the pit, she thought she'd escaped. When she returned home that evening, Armand saw the sadness in her eyes before she even spoke. "They're talking about me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "About us." Armand put down the firewood he was carrying. "Let them talk," he said calmly. "They don't know the truth. But it hurts," she whispered. "No matter how strong I try to be, it hurts." He nodded slowly, looking at her with quiet understanding. "Hira, people will always speak. They did the same when my parents died. Said I'd never survive alone. Said I'd lose the farm. Said I was cursed. But I learned something. People's words only have power if you give them power." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "I'll try." Armand smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can do, try." That night, Hira stood by the window as snowflakes drifted lazily outside. Inside, the fire glowed, and the warmth wrapped around her like a silent promise. She realized that while the world outside could be cruel, there were still people who chose to be kind. People like Armand. New beginnings. Spring arrived with a splash of color. Wildflowers painted the hillsides, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. With the new season came new chances. One morning, as Armand repaired the fence near his field, Hira approached him, her eyes determined. "Armand, I want to work," she said. I can't keep depending on your kindness. I want to earn my keep. He wiped his hands on his shirt and looked at her thoughtfully. You already help more than enough, Hera. No, she insisted. You saved me. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. Let me do something in return. After a long pause, Armand nodded. All right, he said with a small smile. There's an old weaving loom in the barn. My mother used to make cloth to sell in town. If you remember how, maybe you could use it. Her eyes brightened. I know how to weave. My mother taught me when I was little. From that day on, Hera spent her mornings in the barn, weaving cloths and stitching scarves with intricate patterns. Her hands moved like they remembered a forgotten dance. Slowly, she began selling them in the nearby town with Armand's help. The villagers who once whispered now watched her with quiet respect. The same mouths that had spread gossip now praised her skill. Each sale gave Hera not just money, but dignity, the one thing she thought she'd lost forever. Healing the heart. As months passed, the connection between Armand and Hera deepened in ways neither of them had planned. There was no confession, no promises, just the quiet rhythm of two people rebuilding life side by side. Sometimes in the evenings, they sat outside, watching the sun sink behind the fields. Hera would talk about small things, her dreams, her fears, her hope to someday open a small shop of her own. Armand would listen, his heart swelling with silent admiration. One evening, Hera asked, "Do you ever feel lonely, Armand?" He thought for a moment. "I used to," he said, "but not anymore." She smiled softly, understanding his unspoken words. The return of shadows. But peace never lasts forever. One afternoon, a group of men arrived at Armand's gate. Among them was Rashid, Hera's former fiancé, the man who had left her on her wedding day. His eyes were cold, his expression proud. "So it's true," Rashid sneered. "You're living with this farmer now, parading yourself like an honest woman." Hera froze, her heart pounding. "Leave," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You lost the right to speak to me that day." Rashid smirked. "You brought shame to both our families. Now you think hiding behind this man will make you pure again?" Before Hera could reply, Armand stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "That's enough," he said in a low, steady voice. "You abandoned her when she needed you most. You don't get to insult her now." Rashid's face twisted in anger. "Who are you to speak for her?" "I'm the man who showed her respect when the world didn't," Armand said calmly. "Now leave before I forget my manners." The men muttered insults as they backed away. But Rashid's pride was already broken. Hera stood in silence, her hands shaking, not from fear but from release. For the first time, she'd faced her past and stood tall. That night she wept silently, not in pain but in freedom. Armand didn't try to comfort her with words. He simply sat beside her, the quiet presence of his kindness stronger than any promise. The new life, months turned into a year. The house that once felt lonely now echoed with laughter and hope. The fields bloomed brighter, the days longer. Hera's small weaving business had grown. People from neighboring villages came to buy her work. One day, as she was packing finished scarves, she looked at Armand and said softly, "You gave me a new life. When the world threw me away, you picked me up." He smiled gently. "No, Hera, you built this life yourself. I only opened the door." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Then thank you for opening it." As the evening sun painted the sky with gold, Armand turned to her and said, "Maybe it's time you stopped calling this my house." She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He smiled, "Because it's our home now." For a moment, silence hung between them, the kind that said more than words ever could. Hera's tears shimmered in the light, but this time they weren't from sadness. That night, the village that once whispered their names now spoke them with admiration. Not because they defied the world, but because they healed it, one act of compassion at a time.